Good morning and welcome. My name is David Hart. I'm the director of the Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions at the University of Maine. You have no idea how much I've been looking forward to welcoming all of you. Don't get me wrong, I've had the pleasure of playing this role at previous meetings of the conference, but boy, is this different. This is the first time in 3 years that we're here together, in person. I don't mean virtually in person, I mean in person. I got an email yesterday from someone in southern Maine who said, "See you tomorrow." And I had to try to figure out exactly what they meant. See you on Zoom, on Teams, on FaceTime. One of the things that's so fun about being here in person is a lot of people that I met on Zoom, they're not all the same height. I just figured they're just the height of their little box there, but no, there's tall people and less tall people. I'm not saying things are back to normal. I'm not even sure I remember what normal was. But I remember this much. Every single time I've attended this conference, and I've been coming for more than 15 years, I've been struck by what a wonderful gathering this is. There's such a great mix of passion, insight, energy, dedication, and it's not just being used to figure out what kind of problems we're facing, but to find solutions to those problems. And there's so many outstanding examples of the kinds of teamwork and collaboration that we're going to need as we strive to create a brighter environmental, social, and economic future. One source of my optimism about the future comes from all the students that are here. High school students, undergraduates, graduate students. We're going to need all their brain power on the road to solutions. I'm sure another source of my optimism is as simple as the early signs of spring. It doesn't hurt that these days are growing longer by leaps and bounds. I'm happy to report that over the weekend I saw an eagle on a nest along the Penobscot River. And so in a few months, I hope to experience the joy that comes from watching an eaglet or two make their way in the world. But I know it's not all smooth sailing. We aren't done yet, at least where I live, with mud season. And after that, you still have to make it through blackfly season. Nonetheless, I predict that there will someday be ripe blueberries along the trail. I draw a lot of my inspiration, my optimism from inspirational leaders, the kinds of leaders who dedicate their lives to building a sustainable world. For me, they include political leaders like Ed Muskie, Margaret Shea Smith, and George Mitchell. But we're equally fortunate to have benefited from extraordinary individuals like John Banks, who spent more than 40 years playing incredibly important leadership roles with the Penobscot Nation's Department of Natural Resources. And I know there are many more young leaders who are following in their footsteps. As just one example, think about Penobscot Nation Tribal Ambassador Molly and Dana, who gave the keynote address at this conference last year, in person, virtually. We're very fortunate to have another outstanding leader as this year's keynote speaker, Judy East. Judy spent most of her career, which spans more than 3 decades, helping rural communities develop and implement plans for their future. Not surprisingly, this work requires the ability to help diverse stakeholders understand. Oh, heavens. Should I go backwards? Oh, sorry about that. Talk about a leader, she can lead from. Do you want to just finish this for me? Because it'll do a better job. The work she does requires the ability to help diverse stakeholders understand and balance many different trade-offs, economic trade-offs, social trade-offs, environmental trade-offs. This would be hard work on a good day, but it's way hard work in a world that seems increasingly polarized. Turns out that political scientists who study polarization actually disagree about whether America is more polarized than ever before, but they definitely agree that the current level of polarization is a major challenge for solving complex problems. So when I listened to Judy's stories about her work, I've always admired her commitment to finding common ground despite the many challenges we face. What does it take to work with communities where so much is at stake and when there is so much about which they differ? Different facts, different values, different preferences, different histories, different cultural identities, different stories altogether. For better or worse, these differences are where so many of our challenges are situated. Paradoxically, those same differences provide creative leaders like Judy with the raw material to build common ground. She's been there year after year, decade after decade, bringing her expertise, her experience, her integrity, and her passion to this work, and it shows. She's learned a lot, and we're very fortunate that today we can learn from her too. Please join me in welcoming Judy to the podium in person.
Thank you. Thank you for reducing those lights. How's the sound? Is it good? Good? Okay. So, thank you, David, for that very nice introduction. And to all of you for having me and participating in the important discussions of this conference. The theme of this talk is that of the discord and seemingly intractable polarization of our times. So, nice and light. I wish to observe first that I am at once honored by David Hart's belief that I have something to offer on this subject, and also humbled and a bit terrified to put forward my perspective on it to all of you. I'm not a social scientist, so I'll not be describing my research, but a lot of what I've learned over the years, and I'm an avid reader, so I'll be sharing some books. I met David as we and several others across the Northeast worked with Dr. Linda Shai of Cornell University to develop a research proposal on how to manage conflict in land use and local and regional governance structures as people migrate into Maine as a result of climate change and the pandemic. And David heard of my contributions and the experience of my career working with rural communities as they balance the many things they have to balance: budgets, growth, population decline, natural resources management, land use, redevelopment, all of those things in the context of who decides the outcomes and how they come to those decisions. So I'm bringing both my life and career experience to this topic and hope it's a contribution. I know it's one of many. I recognize the shoulders I stand on and the colleagues with whom we all share the challenge of this topic. I hope you can see that cartoon. I think we all recognize the times that we live in are extreme. And I'm going to focus my remarks on the extreme and often polarized responses we increasingly take to these complex challenges and changes we face, but also the labels that we use to separate us into those polarized extremes. The danger of that polarization, the empathy we need to develop given the roots of that polarization, and some techniques I've learned over the years to address it. And then, of course, the many resources and people, uniquely and proudly Maine resources and people that offer a way forward. And again, these are my lessons learned. They're not the assertions of any single answer to what is a mighty problem. So what are my labels over the years? What have I been called? The first one was a switchboard operator. It's funny, some of the remarks I'll make later, that this is actually from the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, but it's still accurate. This is voicemail in the 1970s. All those wires, all that paper. In any event, I was very attracted. I've always loved science, and I loved canoeing on lakes, and so I wanted to study freshwater ecology. While I was in university, I spent 2 summers working in the research department of an investment brokerage firm in downtown Toronto. And I had this cognitive dissonance between these investment decisions people are making in the stock market and what I cared about in terms of biology and acid rain. So I said, okay, I better study economics. And one of the things I learned was that there are these terms in economics called pollution is an externality of the economic system. And there are mechanisms to internalize those externalities through market systems. Back then it was credits to pollute, sulfides, oxides of sulfite and nitrogen. And I then and still think that these are bizarre terms to internalize the externalities as a way of dealing with, pollution. But in fact, the carbon credit system that we're working on now is a way of internalizing to our economic system the externality of carbon pollution. So it's there, it exists, we're using it. But I realized there's a lot more in this decision making. And so I enrolled in the School of Community and Regional Planning at University of British Columbia, because what I saw were the need for cross-disciplinary conversations and collaboration, that there were this thing called policy, the need to integrate these things together, to communicate, and then to study group dynamics and how people talk to one another. I drew on the ecological knowledge that I based, because there is ecological systems. There is strength in diversity that is fundamental understanding of ecology. Very early on in my graduate degree career, Skye asked me, so you want to be a planner? And I think it was a pickup line, but still. I had this double take of a planner. Is that what I'm going to be when I do all this, when I take this degree? And I guess it is. Colleague and friend of mine, Marianne Hayes, she's in the innovation office at Maine DOT. She's been called the connective tissue, which I think is also a really good description of what a planner does. Another label that I very happily and proudly wear is that of a listener and a lifelong learner. And I have a passion of interest in history and psychology. So what are the other labels in my career path? First job was as a town planner on the east end of Long Island, town of East Hampton. And I admit it, we called them, those from the city or up island, with a bit of a sneer, because we were the ones in the rural, lovely town of East Hampton, and they came out in the summer. And remember, this is pre-internet, pre-cell phone. If you can imagine, many of you I know realize that, many don't. So there was definitely a seasonal shift between when they arrived. When I moved to Vermont in the 90s, I was a flatlander. In Prince Edward Island in the early 2000s, the term they use is come from away. They like acronyms, so you could also just be a CFA. In Maine, we know the term. We are from away or local. And my favorite, in Alberta, this is the early 80s. The mayor of Calgary at the time, he ultimately became the premier of Alberta. He called us Eastern creeps and bums. That's a good one, isn't it? And what occurs to me is, it's great that we're all together, but I know you have some more out there, and I kind of wish the chat function was you could tell me what the labels are that you all have experienced. These labels are not always unwelcoming. There is a Broadway show on right now called We All Come From Away. And it tells the story of how the Newfoundlanders welcomed all of the people who were grounded on the planes who were forced to land on 9/11. They were stuck there for 2 or 3 days. I'm actually going to New York the end of the month, and I'm hoping that I get to see this show. On the tougher side of these labels, I do want to recognize the painfulness of them and the very real schisms that they represent and that persist as a result of them. On this continent, we have a heritage of conquest, racism, xenophobia, sexism, and homophobia. And we're still reckoning with all of those things today. If there's any Outlander series fans out there, yeah. She takes a really interesting twist on this term. The Scots called the dreaded English Outlanders, and in Gaelic that was Sassenach. And what Diana Gabaldon does is she twists it and turns the term Sassenach into also a term of endearment between the two principal characters, in addition to the way it's normally uttered with contempt. The other dichotomies, immigrants and citizens, straight, LGBTQ, and people who support them, the impoverished and the wealthy, there's been a dichotomy there for centuries. The descendants of those whose land was taken and the descendants of those who took it. The Aboriginal and tribal sovereignty issue is with us right now in the legislature. The descendants of those who were enslaved and the descendants of those who enslaved them. These issues persist. And here I'm going to start recommending books. If you haven't read the 1619 Project, I highly recommend it. It's a compendium of stories. It's called A New Origin Story for Our Country. The title references the year that the first 20 enslaved people disembarked from a ship in Virginia, 400 years ago. And the legacy of enslavement, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, lynching, mass incarceration is with us today. I recommend in particular, the whole book is amazing, but chapter 17 called Progress. The thesis of this is that we're prone in our political discourse, when called upon to reckon with continuing inequality and injustice, to say, but look how much progress has been made. It stymies the conversation and allows for continued inaction in the areas that still demand our attention, with the exception this week of the signing of the Emmett Till anti-lynching law, which is a very welcome exception to that thesis. There's an appeal to this us-them polarization, to those who use it, as well as to those who buy into it. It's very powerful. It sells, too. Conflict sells. It's inflamed, and it appeals to fundamental values in many cases. Basic survival of a culture, a person, or a family, what's called lizard brain, the part of your brain to which primitive, non-rational, and self-interested behavior is attributed. And finally, as this cartoon, which I hope you can see, points out, it overemphasizes the number of people who feel as extreme compared to the, boring, the ones who don't. At its worst, and I have to, again, recognize the profound societal significance and breadth of this topic when I say, again, with humility, that this is my experience of what I see to be the worst manifestations of this polarization: fear, blame, and xenophobia. It's a zero-sum game. I win. If I win, you lose. No, if you win, I lose. I mixed that one up. this notion that the pie is only so big and it can't grow. I encountered this in Prince Edward Island. There is a history of poverty, a real one, in Prince Edward Island, in the Canadian Maritimes. But it can also be a poverty of imagination, that things can change and grow. I think, let's see if I'm advancing this. Am I? Yeah, sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button. We've all seen the bumper stickers expressed in far less coarse language than I'm using here. If you can't read it, go back where you came from, we're full. There's a demonization in this language. Putin is using it right now. His propaganda is saying to the Russian people that the Ukrainians are governed by Nazis. It has a tendency to dehumanize. All right, so now we're going to get really into it. I believe that the worst of our polarization is based in trauma, because behind the hate and the anger is usually fear or sadness, often profound sadness. And behind sadness is often loss and betrayal. I like this description, or this, I don't know, is that a meme? Anyway, this poster. Russell Brand is just saying, tell me I'm wrong about this. I really like the expression on his face. And what he's actually depicting is the research of Vincent Felitti, a doctor, into adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, that assert that trauma is the gateway to addiction, not any of the substances we often say are a gateway, like nicotine or alcohol. And Felitti also observes that we treat people's solutions as problems. So substance abuse, or numbing, as Brené Brown calls it, and I'll come back to Brené Brown, she's amazing, is a coping mechanism for fear and pain, trauma. But it's a protective mechanism to cope with that pain. It's protective, but often, tragically, very destructive. So in the particular dysfunction of my family history and my explorations of addictions, rage addiction in particular, I've really seen that trauma, whether in childhood or from the experience of war, can lead us to these us-them polarizations. I'm the daughter of 2 generations of veterans in the First and Second World Wars, both grandfathers, my uncle, father, and mother, they all served. I'm proud and I'm grateful for their service. And I heard of the extraordinary bonds they formed in war, and also of the sacrifice and the loss they incurred as a result of it. And as the youngest daughter of that family of 2 generations of veterans on both sides, I know what it is to live with unnamed, unacknowledged, unprocessed, and never mentioned PTSD. I also know the shame and the secrets of unacknowledged, unprocessed, never mentioned mental illness, again, on both sides of my parents' families. And I know the profound confusion and fear engendered by explosive rage generated by this lack of acknowledgement and processing of trauma and family secrets. So experimentation with substances that numb the pain of childhood fear can be addictive. But there's many other coping mechanisms: defensiveness, caustic sarcasm, perfectionism, rage itself, bigotry, and, yes, name-calling dichotomies. And those things themselves can be addictive. And I share this not to describe myself as unique. I know I'm not. Who among us does not have a friend, colleague, or family member who doesn't struggle with substance abuse? And who among us does not have a friend, colleague, family member who doesn't struggle with mental illness? The Me Too movement tells us just how common it is that a family member, friend, colleague has experienced childhood, schoolyard, or workplace sexual assault and abuse. We have to name these things. We have to remove the negative power. that they hold over us. And there are ways, and that's what I'm shifting to next. I want to share 2 amazing books that I've come across in the last couple of years. The first is The Body Keeps the Score, Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. Bessel van der Kolk is the author. So what he describes is that in addition to the usual talk therapies, he describes the work of Dr. Francine Shapiro in EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a type of therapy that has demonstrated that the mind can heal from psychological trauma in much as the body recovers from physical trauma. It's an 8-phase treatment. I have to condense such a huge amount into, I'm not doing it justice, but essentially that there is this bilateral stimulation of eye movements associated with gaining insights into the traumatic experience that can transform feelings from pain to survival and strength. And those eye movements, and this is the coolest part, are very similar to the rapid eye movements of deep REM, dream state sleep. And that's where I shift now. Oh, and also, unlike talk therapy, the insights that are gained in this EMDR therapy are not so much the clinician's interpretation of talk. Sometimes you don't even know what it is that you're processing. But from the client's, and it's accelerated. They're accelerated intellectual and emotional processes. And it has proven so effective that it's now recommended as a treatment for trauma in the practice guidelines of the American Psychiatric Association and in the Departments of Defense and Veterans Affairs. And I mention it in the context with why we sleep, because, and the subtitle there is Unlocking the Power of Sleep and Dreams. Matthew Walker describes research, which we've only recently been able to do with types of measuring systems, to truly monitor what's going on in the brain of the sleeper in that deep REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep. And that there is healing. Well, and he also documents that there is an advantage of having deep REM sleep in healing and mental acuity and memory and intellectual functioning. And he also looks at how humans sleep is compared to how other animals sleep and how much more humans sleep than other animals. And so what that has granted to humans in terms of evolutionary advantage over time. So if you're into data and brain chemistry and evolutionary biology, and I know you're out there, you're going to love these books. That I found them enormously insightful. So, okay, I guess you can see that. These people at the front. Shifting to, so what do we do about this? Polarization, this us-them labeling, is an oversimplification, and we face enormous complexity. I looked up the antonym of polarization and found that it is connect and repair, which I thought was quite beautiful. We face an epidemic of the opiate addiction phenomenon, climate change, PFAS contamination, war, and mass migration on this planet. You name it. Every one of those is extraordinarily complex. The answers are not going to come from this us-them polarization. So, what are some of the techniques and tools and the people who can help us get beyond these easy dichotomies and to navigate that complexity? When I worked in Vermont for the Vermont Land Trust, we had a donation of an extremely large amount of money from a philanthropic organization on the condition that the organization go through, hire an organizational development consultant and basically get our act together, which is pretty brilliant on the part of the philanthropist, I thought. So Susan Edsel was the person we hired, and she described this technique, or this vehicle, the ladder of inference. and to help us have our conversations more constructively. It's the work of Peter Senge from the fifth discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. And at the bottom of the ladder of inference, if you can't, it looks like you can't see it, but at the very bottom of the ladder is data. Get just the facts. And as you move up the ladder, you add meaning to those facts. And then further up, you start making assumptions and ascribing motives. And then you come to conclusions and start to generalize and sometimes stereotype. And at the very top are where you've adopted pretty strongly held beliefs. And the imagery there is pretty interesting, because remember, at the bottom of the ladder, you're a whole lot more stable with data than you are at the top of the ladder with those firmly, perhaps not willing to move beliefs. And as you go up the ladder, you go up in terms of advocacy, but coming down the ladder is inquiry. And what Susan helped us work on, and this is the us there is the regional directors at the Vermont Land Trust. We also did, as part of this, the Myers-Briggs personality trait testing. Virtually every one of us was an ENTJ, and I know those who've done this know what an ENTJ is. Type A personalities, right? I mean, when we had a position, we were going to fight for it. And she would bring us down that ladder of inference to ask, what is the data? What is the information that you're basing this assertion upon? It's a very powerful tool and technique to remember to come down and ask, okay, what are we really talking about here? It also illustrates the danger of lies and inaccurate data. Because if you're starting with a foundation where you can't even agree on what the truth is, then once you get up to the top of the ladder, you're in crazy town. You're in conspiracy theories based on complete fabrication. But it's still a useful tool. Another thing that I also learned working in Vermont, in the land trust field, is the lesson of paradox. When I was working there, my assumption, which is relatively naive, was that those who supported the work we did in land conservation would be progressive, as I defined it, Democrats. It was naive. And that they would support sort of any kind of effort to protect natural resources. What I encountered, though, is that some funders were extraordinarily conservative, libertarian, in fact, and that they had very staunch feelings about land conservation because it was a property rights issue. This is my land, I could develop it or I can conserve it, but that is my property right. And that is an internally consistent set of thinking on one piece of property. So my first lesson there was that the desire to protect land can emerge from across the political spectrum, which was pretty great to learn. That we can have common values and different means of doing things. But also, if you step back from that single property, that single farm, you realize that you can't rely on land conservation alone to protect our resources. There is a role for regulation. And protecting land by voluntary conservation, but not regulation, is a false dichotomy. Because not everyone can conserve their land. There's not enough money to do that, nor would we want to. We need housing. We need all sorts of things from the resources that we have to house, feed, and grow as a species. But what Brené Brown speaks of, I'm reading her book called Atlas of the Heart, Mapping Meaningful Connection and the Language of Human Experiences. I highly recommend it. It just came out. She discusses the value of engaging with paradox. Oh, you know what I forgot to say, which I wanted to point out? Don't you love the definition of paradox in Latin? Seemingly absurd, but really true. I love that. Anyway, Brené Brown quotes Jim Collins and Bill Lazier in a book called Beyond Entrepreneurship 2.0, and I've got to get a copy of this one. They say false dichotomies are undisciplined thought. Builders of greatness are comfortable with paradox. They don't oppress themselves with what we call the tyranny of the or, which pushes people to believe things must be A or B, but not both. Instead, they expand the conversation with the genius of the and. And there are examples, I don't know if you can see it, creativity and discipline, innovation and execution, humility and audacity. I get that one today. Freedom and responsibility. And Brené Brown concludes on this issue. A large body of research shows that rejecting paradox can result in conflict and turmoil. Conversely, engaging with a paradox and accepting the competing elements as both valid can foster creativity, innovation, and productivity. I want to point you to starting to get into Maine examples of addressing this issue, specifically cross-disciplinary integration. And I'm reminding you of the initiatives that are part of the Maine Climate Council work to address equity as they relate to this subject. The George Mitchell Center contributed to this first assessment on the left, the assessment of potential equity outcomes. Their work was released at the same time that all of the 6 working groups who contributed to the Maine Climate Council work, the final document, Maine Won't Wait. At the same time, we all sort of put it all out there. But then their work led to the creation of a permanent equity subcommittee whose initial recommendations were just released. So that's the one on the right, just last month. And what this has led to are there's some really excellent shared definitions within that equity report on environmental justice, frontline communities, and then the other terms that recognize and seek to address a history in which the worst impacts of environmental degradation, those externalities, have too often fallen disproportionately on vulnerable communities, low income, indigenous, people of color. And so this really continues a tradition of Maine leadership in addressing complexity and calling out hate and polarization. And I just have to recognize a few of them here. You know them. Margaret Chase Smith. She denounced McCarthyism at a time when everyone else was afraid to do so. And she was a telephone operator. She was a switchboard operator. I learned that in my research. Edmund Muskie, very progressively supporting some of the best legislation we have for clean water, clean air, civil rights. He was derailed in his presidential bid, by the way, by what's known as the Canuck letter. I can't go into the details. We don't have enough time. Look it up. It was lies. It was released very deliberately to say that he was racist against both Black Americans and those of French-Canadian, or pardon me, Franco-American heritage. Wasn't true, but it worked. And he kind of ended that effort in a presidential primary. George Mitchell, of course, played a leading role in negotiations for peace in Northern Ireland and the Middle East. And this very conference and the George Mitchell Center, that is his legacy, has a foundation of public service and, to the subject today, interdisciplinary collaboration and communication. Bill Cohen, first Republican Secretary of State for a Democratic president. And as Dana Dewar of the Washington Post said, a career-long maverick with a reputation for fashioning compromise out of discord. And of course, Olympia Snowe, who cited hyper-partisanship as leading to a dysfunctional Congress as the reason from her retirement from the Senate. She's now a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center on political she co-chairs its Commission on Political Reform. I know her best through the Olympia Snow Women's Leadership Institute. She formed on her retirement, specifically to strengthen Maine and its people. During the research, she discovered that the challenges facing young women, she discovered a statistic that girls lose confidence 3.5 times faster than boys as they transition from middle to high school. And so this program is rooted in a 3-year program where a cohort of girls is supported by, they are called Olympia's leaders. The advisors are Olympia's leaders' advisors. And in 10th grade, they explore their values. In 11th grade, their voice. And then in 12th grade, their vision. It's grown from 45 girls in 7 schools in Androscoggin County in 2015 to over 540 girls in 36 schools in every county across the state. I've served as an Olympia's Leaders Advisor for 6 years, working with 2 cohorts of girls in the Calais High School. And I'm going to take a risk. Are there any Olympia's leaders here today? Okay, that was a risk. Is she Olympia's leader or an Olympia's leader advisor? Excellent. Well, if you meet an Olympia's leader, and you will, you will know that they know their values, they have a vision, and they've also got the resilience to change that vision if necessary, and they're continuing to find and refine their voice. And it just gives me chills to think of all those young women coming along, marching through time. And that's Olympia Snow's legacy. So shifting to academia, the students, the people who've been my colleagues that students can rely on. Tora Johnson's been a colleague for over 17 years. She's the director of the GIS Service Center and Laboratory at UMaine Machias and chair of the Environmental and Biological Sciences Division at UMaine Machias, or the system. In addition to being a dynamo of GIS, her human ecological research is centered on dignity as a guiding principle. She focuses on best practices for resolving conflict and engaging diverse people in productive decision-making. That photo, by the way, is a group of an extraordinary cohort of students we worked with. I can't believe it was 10 years ago. Not only did they support Washington County towns with online parcel maps, planning maps, and maps with storm surge and sea level rise scenarios, they did it while they were beta testing the ArcGIS Online project, or software, that Esri was releasing. And you know what's really great? I just got to say they were beta testing ArcGIS Online, and you know what I'm talking about. Another new colleague of mine, Vanessa Levesque, she also worked with David Hart, myself, and others to support the research proposal by Linda Shai to examine the means of addressing conflict in rural governance structures. Vanessa is focused on transdisciplinary knowledge to action projects centered around climate adaptation. And I learned in looking her up, I grabbed a few LinkedIn profiles here, that we both did our undergraduate thesis on zooplankton, which was cool to find out, Vanessa. Eileen Johnson as well at the Rue Center for the Environment at Bowdoin College. She teaches environmental social science courses that integrate digital and computational technologies, very similar to Tora, and focuses on how decision support tools can inform local decision making, pulling complexity together and helping inform decision making. Bridie McGreevy, another powerhouse in this field, Associate Professor of Environmental Communication and a faculty fellow at the Mitchell Center. She studies how communication shapes sustainability and justice efforts in coastal shellfishing communities, in river restoration, and freshwater conservation. And now I'd like to shift to some of the practitioners. Not that all of those people aren't practitioners, but I want to mention specifically Maine Sea Grant in general. I've worked with many past and current members of the Maine Sea Grant and Cooperative Extension crew. It's an exemplary organization. They cross disciplines, they stress communications and outreach. Every one of them is a trained facilitator. So if you have Sea Grant at the table with your process, you will have clear, inclusive, and rigorous work done for you. Deb Burwell and Carol Carrillo at Paddling the Rapids. I've worked with Deb, not yet with Carol, in several settings. If she's facilitating your meeting, you're going to get to the heart of the issues you face, complex as they are, and have a clear product and set of decisions that are your decisions that she helped you reach. Carol Martin, another one. Her website, I love it. My purpose in life, she says, is to turn complex opportunities into attainable outcomes by supporting new ways of thinking and doing. I've also worked with Carol several times. She's got a very clear understanding of process, respect for complexity, and supports groups in finding their path toward decision making. And I just want to stress that. These people they're not making these decisions for you. They're helping you get to those decisions. My good friend Sarah Strickland is another facilitator. She's got a nose for those essential questions that you need to be put in front of a group, bringing you back down that ladder of inference to get to the data and the assumptions that you're making. She and Deb are a great team too, Deb Burwell. They helped the Down East Fisheries Partnership on a strategic plan several years ago. And I guess I have to include one guy, and this is a good one. Craig Freshley. I haven't worked with Craig for many years, but I couldn't list some of these resources without mentioning him. He totally understands group dynamics. He's been working in this field for for decades, and knows how to help a group reach a joint understanding of their issues and then come to decisions that they can support. And then finally, I have to mention Nancy Smith of Grow Smart Maine. I hope you can see that picture. It is a rocking picture of Nancy. Apart from it, she has an extraordinary depth of Maine issues. She's a forester by training, a farmer by avocation, a two-term state legislator, and a superb communicator. So there are many partnerships beyond the individuals that I've chosen to call out. They were just some of the exemplary examples for me. But within the regional planning commissions and the economic development districts, loads of partners I've worked with over the years. The Maine Municipal Association, Kate Dufour in particular, and many dozens, hundreds of municipal volunteers. The Office of Community Development at DECD is a very small and very mighty group of individuals. They play really well in the sandbox with the US EPA and DEP Brownfields program, along with the consulting community. Some of colleagues who I've met today, or re-met today, of engineers and geologists and surveyors and architects. The people in state government. I've been outside of state government for many years and just been now back in for a couple. But the people at IF&W, in the beginning with Habitat program, multiple sectors within Department of Transportation, the former State Planning Office, DEP, and now the bureau that I'm in, Resource Information and Land Use Planning, and then as well the relatively new Office of Policy and Innovation and the Future in the Governor's Office. There are so many people. Maine is, I call them friends and colleagues. I also, in terms of what sustains me, call on my family and young friends of my daughter, who is an alum of UMaine. There is a depth of expertise and gravitas and empathy in both substance and process in Maine. And even though we face some truly wicked problems, I'm confident that we have the people, the institutions, and the skills to meet these challenges of climate change, PFAS, microplastics, marine use conflicts, you name it. All of these practitioners understand the words, Can you guys read that? Shall I read that out loud? It's worth reading out loud, isn't it? Maya Angelou said that she's learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And these men, and mostly women, I've got my biases, have sustained me in my work with communities for over 20 years in Maine, and we are rich indeed in drawing on their expertise. So to the next generation of scientists and practitioners and educators, I recommend them all to you. Some of them are here today, and I look forward to working with you. Thank you. Did I leave time? Did I leave enough time?
So we have time for questions. There are a couple of people, I think, who have mics. Can you let me know where the folks with mics are so that we can come to you? That way everybody will hear. Do I have the microphones up here?
I think they're those, aren't they?
Oh, right. Oh, I see. So are you taking those two people? Is that the idea? That's one of the helpful things I find is that people can explain things to me and then I know what's going on. Fantastic. So raise your hand if you have a question. And before we do that, though, as you're getting your questions ready, you may have heard that she has a background in biology and ecology, and I'm glad you worked on zooplankton. We didn't get you a gift that was a zooplankton, but we did get you a gift that is an invertebrate in Maine that has a planktonic larval state. So hang on.
Excellent.
It's this middleless, edgeless, blue mussel straight from Edgecombe.
Beautiful. Thank you so much.
Wow. Okay, bring on the question. Come on. Michelle.
Thank you for a wonderful talk today. It was really engaging. Something that stood out to me was in the beginning, you had mentioned that you're not a social scientist by training, yet you drew heavily on your main ground. What were some of the barriers for you to begin trying to incorporate your teaching as a psychologist into your work in natural resources?
The barriers to integrating her work into my work. Where I first learned of her was actually through the Olympia Snow Women's Leadership Institute. And what resonated with me, she talks a lot about the courage to be vulnerable and describing mental illness in your family. Is something to get past in order to realize and take away the power that it has. You know, that you shouldn't talk about that. No one talks about that. They never used to. So this is old stuff, right? I mean, this is the 1940s. They certainly didn't talk about it. But what resonates to me in what she says is, again, that power of paradox. That she says, this is one of her paradoxes, vulnerability in you is courageous, but vulnerability in me is weakness. And I think that's really, really powerful to get you to go beyond just the facts and to get to the heart of the issue that's in front of you and talk about the hard stuff in dialogues, in communities, and the political realm that we all operate in. I mean, everything's political, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Other question?
I liked your ladder slide there.
Isn't it great?
But you did, briefly mention the fact that at the bottom of that ladder, there's data or like at least some common sense of understanding that helps you sort of climb it together. So when you don't have that bottom, how do you sort of establish? Do you have any thoughts on how to establish that common sense of understanding?
I think you keep talking about the fact that the data is still under review. It's still being, it's imperfect. And if you recognize that data evolves with more understanding, that you don't get solidified in a belief that there's one set of data and there will never be more data. And so I think it's all a matter of remembering and keeping the inquiry going, and being humble about when we don't know. And if we don't know, then let's be careful about the assumptions we start to make about what we don't know. Does that make sense? Or what we don't know fully.
More questions? If not, I've got one. So I just want to build off the last question. In your work with communities, when the data are not there or no agreement about it, are there times when it's helpful to have people bring their respective data, whatever that looks like for this issue, to the table? People talk a lot about, for example, citizen science or just a general co-production process of, okay, we all have data of some set, either both for, is there a problem? How do we define it?
Right.
What do we still need to know before we can go farther? Does that come up?
It definitely comes up, as does the issue of this data is better than that data. I have had municipal officials, I've written a lot of comprehensive plans where you do surveys of what people think and want for their community. And they like to ask the question of whether you're a resident or a non-resident. And I have had municipal officials quite literally say, take all the input from the non-residents and throw it away. It doesn't matter. They are, even though they're property owners, taxpayers, they don't live here, they're not from here. So I think you have to, getting sort of, I know I jumped off your question, but I've had to resist that and say, but they pay taxes or something. Okay, if you want to make it explicit that this is coming from that group of people and not this group of people, then say so. And just be clear about where the information is coming from and whose perspectives are being put forward. And if it's an opinion rather than a verifiable fact, say it's an opinion. I don't know, I'm rambling a little bit because I'm on a little bit of I just got through this high, so I don't know if I answered your question.
Maybe one more question? Somebody at a time? Yeah, so we'll take, this is our last.
Okay. Hey, Cassie.
I've been so lucky to work with you on the planning council and this amazingly inclusive process, I think, that's been built there. I wanted to ask you, I think we have some great examples here in Maine of being inclusive and working with people across barriers to work for towards real solutions with that solid foundation that you described. How do you think we could approach sharing that outside of Maine with others in an effective way to maybe inspire really working inclusively elsewhere?
I missed the last bit. Say that again?
How do you think we could take some great examples from Maine and share them, with other parts of the U.S. and the world to inspire that sort of inclusive, collaborative approach?
Well, as you know, one of the ways is to share it at conferences like this, and I think once the equity subcommittee completes its work with all of the 6 working groups and comes to a final set of equity of recommendations that are really knit into the Climate Council's work, I think that will be very powerful. The other way, and you know I'm working on this, Cassie, is I'm nominating with others. Maine Won't Wait for the National American Planning Association Award in Resilience and Sustainability. I think we're gonna get it. The submission was supposed to be in March and it was delayed until June, so we'll see what happens. But it's putting ourselves out there as models. And David and I were talking about this ahead of time. He's getting phone calls from all over the country. What are you guys doing there in Maine on these issues of addressing the need to collaborate and cross disciplines in order to achieve outcomes on these complex issues? I think Maine, like I said, with the history all the way back to Margaret Chase Smith, has a reputation for figuring this out. And it's truly one of the reasons that I want to nominate Maine Won't Wait for the National Award, because people go, oh, well, it's got a national award, so what'd you do? And I think that we need to sell this and look what we're doing here on the national stage. I think Governor Mills has already done that at the UN when she launched the whole process. We need to go back and say, and this is what we did and how we've implemented it too. Because there's a lot of implementation going on that is a model for other states and other countries.
So I think I'm looking for Ruth, who I'll mention more about later at lunch, but I think the idea now is we're supposed to go to lunch, and usually the way it works is it's done by table. Is that the way this is going to work? Anybody know? Obviously I should know, but apparently clueless. Maybe we're small enough this year that it's not a big deal, but the idea is that if you all rush at the same time, you'll wait in line a little bit longer, but maybe that's fine, right? Make a friend. So let's start that process, but before we do, one last time to thank Judith.